There are no trees on these islands, not one. Not a single native tree across 4,700 square miles of land, an area larger than half of Wales. There were no people either. When Europeans first came ashore, they found no villages, no fires, no boats drawn up on the beaches, nothing at all. And there were no mammals, no mice, no deer, no rodents of any kind. Except one, a wolf. On an archipelago 300 miles from the nearest continent, with no land bridge, no forest, and no other mammal to hunt, there lived a single species of wild dog. Charles Darwin found it here in 1833. He could not explain it. Nobody could. We now know it had been living on these islands for at least 1,000 years before any human being knew they existed. Darwin was not impressed by the place. He called the landscape desolate and wretched. He was not the first to say so, and he would not be the last. For most of recorded history, this archipelago has been described as somewhere with nothing worth having. And yet, today, the people who live here have among the highest incomes per person on Earth, around £85,000 each. The government carries no debt at all, not reduced debt, none. It pays for its own hospital, its own schools, its own roads, out of its own revenue. Both things are true at the same time. This is one of the emptiest inhabited places on the planet, and it is one of the wealthiest. Every reason these islands were ever settled has since been erased. The cattle, the seals, the ships, the wool. One by one, each one ended. And each time, the place should have emptied out. It never did. So what exactly is keeping it here? The Falkland Islands sit in the South Atlantic at 52 degrees south. Two large islands, east and west, and 776 smaller ones scattered around them like fragments of something broken, which, in a sense, they are. 400 million years ago, this land was joined to what is now southern Africa. When Gondwana split apart, the fragment that would become the Falklands drifted west, rotated as it went, and came to rest against the edge of the South American shelf. The rock beneath your feet here is not South American rock. It is African rock in the wrong hemisphere, sitting quietly off the coast of Patagonia. Nothing about this place is where it is supposed to be. The wind arrives from the west and does not stop. These latitudes are called the Roaring Forties and the Furious 50s, and the names are not decoration. There is nothing between here and Australia but open water. The wind crosses the entire Southern Ocean without touching land, and it strikes these islands at full strength every day of the year. Everything that lives here has had to answer that wind. Some of the answers are very strange. In the coastal grasslands, down in the dead leaves at the base of the tussock, there is a cricket. Its name is Parudinus falklandicus. It is the only cricket native to these islands, and it lives nowhere else in the world. 20 millimeters long, sometimes more, and built like something that gave up on speed a long time ago. It cannot fly. It has no wings to fly with. It is not alone in this. The small moths that live in the tussock cannot fly. The kelp flies along the shoreline cannot fly. Across the invertebrates of this archipelago, wing after wing has been shortened, reduced, abandoned entirely. Biologists think they understand why. Wings are expensive to build and expensive to carry. On a small island, there is nowhere far to go. And out here, an insect that opens its wings on the wrong afternoon is not migrating anywhere. It is being carried out to sea, and it is not coming back. So the wind took the wings. It is worth holding on to that, because the cricket is not the strangest thing on these islands that stopped flying. Inland, the land rises slowly. There are no peaks here in the way most people picture peaks. Mount Usborne, the highest point on the archipelago, reaches 705 meters, a long brown swell of ground rather than a summit. But the valleys below it hold something that stops people mid-sentence. They are called stone runs. Rivers of grey quartzite boulders, some of them the size of cars, pouring down the valley floors in long ribbons that can run for miles. No soil between them, no vegetation, just rock on rock on rock, sorted and stacked as though something poured them out and walked away. They look like glaciers made of stone, and that is not far from what they are. The rock was shattered by freezing and thawing over and over through the cold stages of the last 2.5 million years. Water worked into the cracks, expanded into ice, and split the rock apart from the inside. Then, the whole shattered mass crept downhill through waterlogged ground, a few millimeters at a time, for tens of thousands of years. That is the leading explanation. It is not the only one. Some geologists argue the runs began forming in a far older and far warmer climate, and that the ice only rearranged what was already lying there. The argument has been running for more than a century, and it is not settled. What is not in dispute is what is missing from these valleys. There are no trees. There have never been trees as far as anyone standing here could possibly tell. Not a stump, not a root, not a fallen trunk anywhere in the peat. And that turns out to be wrong. The proof is buried underneath the capital. The capital stands on the north shore of a long, narrow harbour on East Falkland. Stanley. Around 2,300 people. Coloured roofs, a stone cathedral, one road running along the water. It was not built here for the view. Stanley was founded in 1843 for a single reason. The harbour is deep. It is sheltered from every direction. And it is the last safe anchorage before Cape Horn. Cape Horn broke ships. That is the plain fact the entire town was built on. A sailing vessel going west around the bottom of South America had to force its way into the prevailing wind, in the worst sea conditions on the planet, sometimes for weeks at a time. Rigging failed. Hulls opened at the seams. Cargoes of coal caught fire in the holds. And a captain with a leaking ship 6,000 miles from home had exactly one option. He turned back and ran for Stanley. The timing could not have been better. In 1849, gold was found in California, and the fastest route from the eastern United States to San Francisco went around the Horn. The traffic became enormous. Stanley filled with damaged ships, stranded crews, and the men who made money from both. For roughly 50 years, this settlement at the bottom of the world was one of the busiest ports on the planet. It was not an honest business. A ship that arrived leaking had to be surveyed before it could be repaired or written off. In Stanley, for many years, the man who carried out that survey was also the leading merchant in town and the local insurance agent. He would examine a damaged vessel, declare it beyond repair, and then buy it himself for very little. The ships he condemned did not leave. They were stripped of their rigging, filled with ballast, and sunk in the shallows to serve as warehouses and jetties. Some of them are still there. The Charles Cooper came in on the 25th of September, 1866, a wooden packet ship out of Connecticut, carrying coal for San Francisco. She was judged to be leaking beyond repair. She never sailed again. The Jalem, an East Indiaman, was abandoned by her crew in 1871. The Lady Elizabeth struck a reef and limped into the harbor in 1913, and she lies today in the shallow water east of town. 3 masts still standing, rust running down her plates into the sea. At one point, the inner harbor held the remains of a dozen square riggers. 16 more lay scattered around the outlying beaches and inlets. The islands earned a name for it: the graveyard of sailing ships. The town that grew around all this was assembled from whatever arrived. Buildings were shipped out from Britain in kit form and put together on site. Christchurch Cathedral was built in 1892 after a landslide destroyed the church that stood before it, and outside it there is an arch made from the jawbones of 2 blue whales. It is the southernmost Anglican cathedral in the world. At the eastern end of the peninsula, a white lighthouse stands at Cape Pembroke, marking the corner where the Atlantic swings south. The first telephone line on these islands ran out to it in 1897 from the police station in Stanley. 14 years later, engineers working for Guglielmo Marconi put up a wireless station here. For the first time in the history of the archipelago, a message could leave these islands without waiting for a ship to carry it. Before that, news of the outside world arrived in bundles, weeks late, and was read in the order it had been written. And then the reason for all of it disappeared.
It went in stages.
In 1876, a British law introduced the load line, a mark painted on a hull showing how deeply a ship could legally be loaded. Overloaded vessels had been the ones most likely to fail at the Horn. Fewer failures meant fewer arrivals. By the 1890s, iron steamships were crossing the same water without needing to beg for shelter. Then, in 1914, the Panama Canal opened. A cut through Central America, 5,000 miles away, ended Stanley's entire economic purpose in a single season. The Cape Horn route was finished. The ships stopped coming. The repair yards emptied. The town had been built for a job that no longer existed anywhere in the world. It did not empty out. It turned to wool, and it held on, and it stayed small and quiet for the next 70 years. Behind the houses, a short way along the shore, there is a stretch of white sand that any town on Earth would have made its beach. For 38 years, nobody was allowed to walk on it. Before Stanley, there was Port Louis. It stands on Berkeley Sound, on the northeast coast, and almost nothing is left of it now. A few walls, a pond, grass going back to Moore. In 1764, a French expedition under Louis-Antoine de Bougainville came ashore here and founded the first human settlement these islands had ever held. Many of the settlers were Acadians, French families expelled from Nova Scotia, people who had already lost one home and were being offered another at the end of the world. The French called the islands the Îles Malouines, after the port of Saint-Malo. The following year, a British expedition under John Byron reached Saunders Island, 200 kilometers to the west, and claimed the entire archipelago for Britain on the grounds that they had discovered it. Neither expedition knew the other was there. 2 European powers founded rival colonies on the same small group of islands, months apart, and for a full year, each believed itself alone in an empty ocean. It is difficult to think of a clearer measure of how little anyone understood about this place. What followed was a century of handovers. Spain bought the French claim and renamed the settlement Port Solitude. In 1770, a Spanish force of 1,400 men in 5 ships arrived at the British outpost at Port Egmont and expelled it. The two countries came close to war. Then, in 1774, Britain simply withdrew, not defeated, but retrenching, pulling back from distant possessions that cost more than they returned. The Spanish garrison left in 1811. In 1820, Buenos Aires proclaimed the islands its own. In 1833, a British force removed the remaining officials without a shot being fired. 4 flags in 70 years. And through all of it, almost nobody actually lived here. In 1833, in the middle of that last handover, a survey ship called the Beagle put in at Berkeley Sound. Her naturalist was 24 years old. Charles Darwin spent several weeks on these islands across 2 visits, and he disliked them thoroughly. Wretched, he called the place. Desolate. He complained about the weather and about the absence of nearly everything. But he wrote down what he saw, and 2 of the things he wrote down have outlived every government that has ever flown a flag here. The first was a bird that stole from him. Dark, long-legged, endlessly curious, arriving in numbers wherever the crew put anything down. They took a large glazed hat and carried it nearly a mile. They took the heavy-weighted cords the gauchos used for catching cattle, and they took a small compass in a red leather case. That one was never recovered. The second thing Darwin recorded was a prediction. He had met the wolf, and he wrote that within a very few years it would be gone from the face of the earth, classed with the dodo as an animal that had perished. He was right. It took 43 years. "200 kilometers northwest of the main islands, past the last farm and the last radio mast, there is a chain of islands with nobody on them at all. Steeple Jason is the outermost of them, a narrow spine of rock and tussac exposed from every direction, and it holds the largest colony of black-browed albatross in the world. They nest in ranks along the western slope, tens of thousands of pairs, each one on a raised pedestal of mud and grass that they build and rebuild every season. These islands as a whole hold roughly 70% of the entire global population of the species, more than 500,000 breeding pairs. An adult black-browed albatross has a wingspan of well over 2 meters, and it barely flaps at all. It uses the wind instead. It rises into the faster air above the waves, turns, drops back down into the trough, and converts the difference in wind speed into distance. A single bird can cross hundreds of kilometers of open ocean on one feeding trip and come back to a nest the size of a bucket on a slope of grass on an island nobody lives on. They pair for life. Some of the birds on that slope have been returning to the same square meter of ground for more than 30 years. The wind that took the cricket's wings gave the albatross everything, which raises a question that becomes harder to ignore the longer you spend out here. The richest places on these islands are the ones where nothing lives, nothing human at least. Steeple Jason has no residents. New Island, further south, has a handful of researchers and no permanent settlement. Carcass Island has a single farm. These are the places that hold the albatross colonies, the rockhopper cities stacked along the cliff ledges, the deepest tussac, the rarest birds. Meanwhile, East Falkland, the large island, the one with the capital and the roads and the farms, has lost most of what it once had. The reason is not complicated, And it is not really about people. It is about what came with them. Rats came off the ships. Cats came with the settlements. Sheep came in their hundreds of thousands and grazed the tussock down to the pedestal. Mice arrived without anyone noticing. On an island where nothing has hunted a ground-nesting bird in 11,000 years, a single pregnant rat is a catastrophe that unfolds over decades. So the map of Falklands wildlife is really a map of arrivals. Where the ships called, the birds went. Where the ships never bothered, they stayed. There is something uncomfortable in that. The most alive parts of this archipelago are alive because nobody could find a reason to go there. Back in Stanley, on the foreshore of the harbour, there is a building called Tussock House. Work in the ground beneath it turned up something that should not have been there. Sealed in a buried deposit lay a bed of ancient plant material, fragments of wood, spores, pollen. And when it was analysed, the pollen was not from grass or heath or diddle-dee. It was from southern beach, from podocarps, from a diverse, cool, temperate rainforest, the kind of forest that grows today in southern Chile. There were trees here, not a few sheltered shrubs in a gully, forest, canopy, a wet, green, closed-in landscape, standing on ground that is now open moor, with the wind moving across it and nothing growing higher than your waist. It is the second such deposit found on the archipelago. So the islands did not fail to grow trees. They grew them for a very long time. Then the world turned cold, and the ice stages came, and the wind rose, and the forest went. And when the climate softened again, there was no seed source left within 300 miles to start it over. That is the thing about isolation. It protects what is already here. It also means that anything lost is lost permanently. Stand on the harbour road in Stanley, and you are standing on a forest. It is directly under your feet, and it has been for a very long time. Out on the islands where the albatrosses nest, there is a bird that watches people work. Islanders call it the Johnny Rook. Its proper name is the striated caracara, and it is a falcon, though almost nothing about its behavior suggests one. It does not perch and wait. It walks. It will cross 40 meters of open ground on foot to find out what you are doing, pull at the zip on a bag, take the cap off your head, and then look you directly in the eye, while it decides whether the thing it has stolen is worth eating. It is the southernmost bird of prey on Earth. In captivity, individual birds have solved multi-step puzzles and learned to fetch a specific colored object on request. One was recorded eating an octopus, which is the first documented case of any falcon managing it. Darwin met these birds in 1833, and he was less charmed than most. He called them tame and fearless, mischievous and inquisitive, quarrelsome and passionate. The crew of the Beagle posted a lookout to stop them taking the ship's rigging apart. The compass in the red leather case was theirs. It has been lying in the ground somewhere on these islands for 190 years, and nobody has ever found it. Darwin also recorded that they were exceedingly common, everywhere across the archipelago. They are not now. When sheep farming took hold in the late 1800s, the Johnny Rook was declared a threat to lambs, and a bounty was placed on it. For roughly a century, islanders were paid to bring them in. Cats and rats did the rest. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 remain. That is fewer birds than there are giant pandas in the wild, and they hold on now only on the outer islands, where the sheep never came. The southern half of East Falkland is a broad, flat, wind-scoured plain called Lafonia. It is named after a man who never lived here. Samuel Fisher Lafone was a Liverpool merchant working out of Montevideo in the hide and tallow trade. In 1846, he was awarded a contract to exploit something these islands had in surplus and nobody was using: cattle. Earlier settlers had landed animals and then left. Over the decades, the herds had gone feral and multiplied across the open ground until there were tens of thousands of them. Lafone brought in gauchos from the River Plate to hunt them down. Within 6 years, the herds were effectively gone, taken for hides and tallow at a speed that surprised everyone involved. So, the company changed the animal. The venture Lafone had founded was granted a royal charter and became the Falkland Islands Company. It brought in Cheviot sheep, and for the next 130 years, that company was less a business operating in the Falklands than the Falklands operating as a business. It owned the largest farms. It ran the shops. It owned the ships that carried the wool out and the flour in. It employed the shepherds, housed them, paid them, and then sold them what they needed with the money it had just paid them. Its center was Goose Green. The farm covered 430,000 acres, twice the size of the next largest holdings on the islands. In 1927, the company built a shearing shed there with capacity for 5,000 animals, and for years, islanders claimed it was the largest in the world. In 1979, 100,598 sheep were shorn inside it. There was a store, an airstrip, and until the 1970s, a state boarding school, where children from farms scattered across a landscape with almost no roads were sent to live, because there was no other way to educate them. It was a company island, and it behaved like one. Wool prices were set in London. Profits left. Through the 1960s and early 70s, the island's economy declined in real terms, while money flowed steadily outward, and the population fell year on year as young people went to Britain and did not come back. A British government report in 1976 examined the situation and described a place being quietly drained. The response, when it finally came, was land. Beginning in 1979, the large company farms started to be broken up and sold as family holdings. Green Patch went first, divided into 6 units. Others followed through the early 1980s. The results were immediate and measurable. Stocking rates on subdivided land rose by as much as 23%. Wool production rose by 27%. The same ground, the same weather, the same animals, and a different answer because the person walking the paddocks now owned them. It did not save wool. Nothing was going to save wool. Global prices went where global prices went, and a farm at 52 degrees south with a 3-month shipping route was never going to win that argument. But it changed who these islands belonged to. Before subdivision, most Falkland Islanders worked land owned by a company registered in London. Afterwards, they owned it. That mattered later, in a way nobody had planned for. Everything outside Stanley is called the camp. The word comes from the Spanish campo, the countryside, and it has survived here for 180 years in a place where almost nothing else Spanish did. Camp is not a region. It is roughly 95% of the land area and a few hundred people. Port Howard, on West Falkland, sits beneath a mountain at the head of a sound and has around 20 residents. North Arm, in the far south of Lafonia, is a settlement of similar size at the end of a long gravel track. Pebble Island has a lodge and a grass airstrip. A settlement here might mean 4 houses, a shearing shed, a fuel tank, and a wind generator. Getting between them is its own institution. The government air service flies small propeller aircraft onto grass strips cut into the paddocks, and the passenger list is read out over the radio the evening before, so everyone knows who is going where. Teachers travel out to the farms and stay 2 weeks at a time with a family, teaching the children of that settlement, then move on to the next one. The local word for staying away overnight is a 2-nighter, because 2 nights is what the journey costs you if you intend to come back. And wherever you arrive, at mid-morning or mid-afternoon, you will be given smoko. The name came out of the shearing sheds from a break for a cigarette. What it means now is cake, home-baked in quantity with tea, scones, biscuits, sponge, jam made from diddle-dee berries that grow low across the moorland, or from tea berries picked by hand. Refusing it is not really available to you. It is worth saying plainly what this is, because it is almost always described wrongly. These islands are usually written about as a strategic question, a dot on a chart that matters because of who claims it. That framing has been repeated so consistently for so long that it has quietly replaced the thing itself. What is actually here is a rural community of a few thousand people, most of them the 5th or 6th generation of their family on this ground, who fly to each other's weddings in 8-seat aircraft and know precisely how far it is to the nearest doctor. They are not a position on a map, they are a place. There is a small brown bird on these islands that most visitors never see, and the reason is not that it hides. It is called Cobb's wren. It is one of only 2 bird species found nowhere on Earth but here. It nests on the ground, in the tussock, under the dead leaf skirts, which works perfectly for 11,000 years and then stops working on the day a rat comes ashore. Today, Cobb's wren survives on a set of islands with one thing in common. Carcass Island, despite its name, has never had rats, nor has Sea Lion Island, nor a scattering of others around the edges of the archipelago. The tussock bird lives by the same rule. So do the burrowing petrels and the shearwaters that nest inside the peat, which produces something strange in conservation terms. On these islands, the most valuable thing a piece of land can have is an absence. Not a protected area, not a fence, not a ranger. Just the fact that one particular animal never happened to get off one particular boat. Conservation work here now runs largely on that principle. Rodent eradications on the outer islands, strict controls on what moves between them, checks on boats that would look excessive anywhere else and are entirely proportionate here. And the plant all of it depends on is a grass. Tussock grows in dense pedestals up to 3 meters high. It tolerates salt spray that would kill almost anything else, and it photosynthesizes below freezing. Of the 62 bird species that breed on these islands, 46 use it. Seals shelter in it. Penguins burrow into it. Its dead leaves compress into peat that can be 10 meters deep and 10,000 years old. Hectare for hectare, an established tussock stand stores carbon at densities comparable to temperate forest. The islands never got their trees back. They grew something else instead. The scale of this place only really registers when you start listing what it holds. At Volunteer Point, on the northeast corner of East Falkland, king penguins breed on a long white beach, and they walk past grazing sheep to reach the sea. Sea Lion Island, to the south, is a low island less than a mile across where southern elephant seals haul out to breed, the males weighing several tons, lying along the shoreline through the spring. Weddell Island, out west, holds more than half of all the native plant species on the archipelago, and also a population of Patagonian grey foxes, brought here in the 1930s by an owner who imported skunks, rheas, and parrots as well. Only the foxes are still there. And the second largest settlement on the islands is not a town at all. Mount Pleasant is a military station built after 1982 out on the open ground of East Falkland. More people sleep there than in any camp settlement, and almost none of them are from here. Along the rocky shores, in among the kelp, there is a duck that cannot fly. The Falkland steamer duck is the other of the two birds found only on this archipelago. Islanders call it the logger duck. It is heavy, grey, and thickly built, with an orange bill and a white line running back from the eye, and when it is alarmed, it does not take to the air. It runs across the water. It beats its short wings against the surface and drives with its feet at the same time, throwing up two long lines of spray behind it, which is exactly how it got its name, because it looks like the paddle wheels of a steamer. Darwin watched them do it in 1833 and wrote that the noise and the splashing made the effect exceedingly curious.
They feed on shellfish,
Prized out of the kelp beds and cracked open with the bill. They are territorial to the point of violence. Males fight over feeding ground and do not give it up. There is a flying steamer duck on these islands too. It looks almost identical. It has functional wings, and it uses them sparingly. The two are close enough that they may still be able to interbreed, which means the flightless one did not lose its wings in some distant geological era. It lost them recently, and quickly, right here, for the same reason the cricket did, and the moths did, and the kelp flies did. Out here, flying is a way of leaving. Almost everything that lives on these islands has arrived independently at the same conclusion. Whatever this place is, it is worth staying for. By the early 1980s, the arithmetic here had stopped working. Wool was the only industry. Prices were poor and falling. The population was under 2,000 and had been declining for decades. The place was not self-sufficient, and there was no realistic path to it becoming so. And the entire time, in the water, there was an enormous amount of money that nobody was collecting. Foreign trawler fleets had been working these seas for years, taking squid out of some of the most productive water in the South Atlantic and paying nobody anything for it, because there was no zone, no license, and no authority. In 1986, the Falkland Islands declare a conservation and management zone around the archipelago and begin selling licenses to fish in it. Government revenue rose by 500%, not 5%, 500. In a single move, a territory that had been a subsidized remnant became self-financing in every area except defense, paying for its own hospital, its own schools, its own roads, and its own pensions out of fees charged for the right to fish in its own water. The fishery is not large by world standards. Total catches run at about a third of what the United Kingdom lands. But in a typical year, 2 species of squid account for roughly 3/4 of everything taken here, and the licenses to catch them now generate the majority of the island's income. Fishing and aquaculture made up more than half of the entire economy in 2024. If you eat calamari in southern Europe, there is a fair chance it came out of this water. Consider what that actually means. These islands were settled for feral cattle, and the cattle ran out. They were worked for seals, until there were no seals left worth taking. They were built up for a shipping route, and a canal in Panama erased it in a season. They were held together by wool, and wool went the way of every commodity produced a very long way from its market. 4 reasons to exist, all 4 gone, and the 5th had been swimming past the whole time, in the dark, at depth, for as long as anyone had stood on this shore, wondering what the place was for. But there is still the wolf. It was not a wolf. It was not quite a fox either. Islanders called it the warra, an anglicized form of aguara, the Guarani word for fox, given to it by gauchos who saw in it something of the maned wolf of the mainland. Its scientific name is Deucicion australis. Darwin, who examined it closely, thought it looked most like a coyote or a jackal. It stood about the height of a medium dog, thick coat, tawny and dark, with a white tip to the tail. It was the only land mammal these islands had. And it should not have been possible. The nearest continent is 300 miles away, across open ocean. There is no land bridge. There is no record of one ever existing. Every other land mammal on these islands today was brought here by a ship. But the warra was here first. Here when the French landed. Here when the British landed. Here when the Spanish garrison came and went again. For 130 years, its presence was one of the genuine unsolved problems in island biology. The explanations were all difficult. That it rafted across on floating vegetation blown off Patagonia, that it crossed on ice floes, that it walked over a frozen strait during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were lower and winter ice reached much further north than it does today. And then the sea rose and shut the door behind it. Ancient DNA taken from museum specimens supports something close to that last one. The warra appears to have separated from its nearest mainland relative around 16,000 years ago. Others have argued for something else entirely, that people brought it, that seafarers from Tierra del Fuego reached these islands long before any European did and carried a half-tame animal with them when they came. What is not in doubt is what happened to it. It had no predators. It had never in its history needed to fear anything that walked. Darwin recorded that the gauchos killed them in the evening by holding out a piece of meat in one hand and a knife in the other. He described one taking meat from underneath the head of a sleeping sailor. It came when called. It walked up to people across open ground, directly, without hesitation, because in the entire evolutionary history of the animal, nothing had ever given it a reason not to. Then the fur trade found it. Then the sheep arrived, and the shepherds decided the warra was a threat to lambs, and it was hunted and poisoned across both main islands. In 1876 at Shallow Bay on West Falkland, the last known warra was shot. It was the first member of the dog family in recorded history to be driven to extinction by human beings. Darwin had published his warning 37 years earlier in print with his name on it. Nobody acted on it. There was never any argument about whether it was happening. Everyone could see that it was happening. About a dozen specimens exist in museums today. One of them was collected by Darwin himself. The animal has been gone for 150 years, and there is no photograph of it alive, only a painted illustration made in 1839 from a dead specimen by an artist who never saw one moving. And that was the end of the story for a very long time. In January 2010, a 13-year-old boy named Dale Evans was spending the summer holiday on his family's farm. He found a bone on the ground. He had been interested in natural history since he was 3 years old, so instead of walking past it, he looked at the site more carefully. Then he kept looking. Over time, he gathered a collection of bones that now carries his name. They were warra, and when one of them was radiocarbon dated, The result came back at approximately 1,000 years old. 1,000 years. Centuries before Bougainville. Centuries before Byron and Saunders Island. Centuries before the beagle, the sheep, the ships, the wool, the squid, the flags. While Stanley was still bare ground, and Europe had no idea these islands existed, something was living on them. Hunting along these shorelines, denning in the peat, raising young in the tussock, walking the same valleys the stone runs pour down. For 1,000 years, and almost certainly far longer than that. The islands, with no reason to exist, were never empty, and they were never waiting. They had a resident. They had one for millennia before anybody arrived to ask what the place was for. And the animal with the least reason of all to be here, the one whose presence has never been fully explained, is the one that did not survive contact with the people who came to ask. There is one more thing that had to be taken out of the ground here, and it took considerably longer. In 1982, a 74-day conflict was fought across these islands. Islanders at Goose Green were held in the community hall while it went on around them. When it ended, in June of that year, the ground was left carrying more than 9,300 anti-personnel mines and over 1,600 anti-vehicle mines laid across beaches, dunes, moorland, and the approaches to Stanley. Clearance was attempted immediately and abandoned almost as quickly after soldiers were injured doing it. The minefields were fenced, marked in red, and left. No islander was ever hurt by one, but the land inside those fences was simply removed from the map, including York Bay, a long white beach 10 minutes from the capital, which any other town on Earth would have used every summer. Clearance began again in 2009, and it took 11 years. Most of the mines were dug out by hand. The teams were largely Zimbabwean, brought in for their long experience of the work, and they lay prone in wet peat in driving rain, clearing soil grain by grain from around devices that had been in the ground for decades. Innocent Mudzamiri, one of the deminers, described the job simply: gently, so that you do not disturb it, with your mind free of everything else. At York Bay, the sand had moved. Dunes up to 15 meters deep had built over the minefields across 38 years of wind, and some devices were recovered more than 15 meters below the surface. Machinery had to sift the sand through a system fine enough that a mine could not pass through it undetected. Penguins had been nesting inside the wire the entire time. Before clearance could begin, it had to be formally assessed whether they were at risk. No penguin on these islands weighs enough to set off a mine. On the 14th of October, 2020, the last known mine on the Falkland Islands is located and lifted out of the ground. A month later, on the 14th of November, the community walked back onto York Bay. There were speeches. Then, the final recovered devices were detonated, once, deliberately, and the beach was open. The penguins were already there. Gentoos nest across these islands in numbers that are difficult to hold in the head. Roughly a third of the entire world population breeds here. They are the fastest swimming birds on the planet, capable of 35 kilometers an hour underwater, and on land, they are the exact opposite. Upright, unhurried, walking the same worn paths between the sea and the colony day after day in single file. At York Bay, they had the run of a beach no human had walked on since 1982. Not because anyone protected it, because of a fence and a warning sign, and 38 years of nobody being able to go in. It is not a comfortable thought. The most undisturbed beach on the archipelago was made by a minefield. but it is the same shape as everything else here. The albatrosses on the islands, nobody settled. The wrens on the islands, the rats never reached. The peat, holding a forest that has been gone for longer than our species has been farming. On these islands, what survives is usually what was left alone. 3,662 people were counted here at the last census. They are not who the outside world tends to assume. A little over half describe themselves as Falkland Islanders, born on this ground, many of them 5th or 6th generation. Around a third are British, but more than 1 in 10 came from St. Helena, another small island in the middle of another ocean. Others came from Chile, from the Philippines, from Zimbabwe, from Peru. Almost everyone works. Most of the growth in the population has come from people choosing to move to a place with no trees and a wind that never stops. The reasons this archipelago was settled have all ended. The cattle were hunted out within 6 years. The seals were taken until there were none worth taking. The Cape Horn trade died in 1914, and the harbour filled with the hulls of ships nobody came back for. Wool held the place together for a century and then quietly stopped being enough. The company that owned nearly everything sold the land and became a shop. Each time, the reasonable expectation was that the islands would empty out. Each time, something else turned up, and the people who were already here stayed long enough to find it. Perhaps that is what a place actually is. Not a resource, not a position on a chart. Just ground that somebody keeps deciding to remain on for reasons that keep changing long after the original reason has gone. The Warra did it for 1,000 years before anyone arrived to ask why. Somewhere out on the west, the wind is coming off 4,000 miles of open ocean, and a grass that stores carbon like a forest is bending under it. A duck that gave up flying is driving a line of white water across a kelp bed. A falcon that walks is turning over a stone to see what is underneath. And on a beach outside Stanley that was closed for 38 years, the gentoos are coming up out of the surf, in single file, the way they always have. If you would like to keep traveling with us, subscribe to the channel. There is another place waiting. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.